So, ladies and gentlemen, in the next 25 to 30 minutes, I will try to develop some reflections on democracy as pseudonymy. One of the defining peculiarities of the political and historical memory of ancient Europe is the fact that a seemingly well-established body politic without notable external threats can land in so deep a crisis that it threatens to degenerate from its quasi-normal mode of operation. And so it was in the first century before Christ in the Roman Empire, whose aristocratic republican constitution that had been preserved over centuries could no longer master the endogenous unrest on Italian soil. A new political form arose, the Roman Respublica, which rested on the consensus omnium, whereby both the title of king and its principle of solo rule would be forever frowned upon by self-assured Romans. Over the centuries, an artfully balanced parallelogram of powers appeared in the place of monarchy, the foundational idea of which was expressed in the formula SPQR. In future, Senate and people of Rome would together form the source of all legitimate exertion of power. And meanwhile, from the beginning, the populusque would perform a rhetorical, not to mention palliative function with regard to the supremacy of the Senate. And among the far-reaching consequences which can be discerned from the relatively long-term existence of the Roman Respublica, one obvious lesson is the fact that palliative politics can be successful so long as it manages to neutralize the unavoidable quota of dissatisfaction among the wider populace through a system of participation, mollification, compensation. And this was achieved not least with the help of the bread and circus provisions, due to which the diversion and the support of the moody masses of the capital must be understood a part of great politics. This observation regarding the Roman Republic can also be applied to the new democracies. Also in our time, a polity which can no longer involve dissatisfied majorities in psycho-political compromise seems especially doomed in that those majorities will ascend during elections to the most radical and tainted manifestos if they do not go as far as to join militias or risk civil war. In the case of Rome, close to 450 years were required after the establishment of the Republic before Cicero could, in the year 60 before Christ, risk referring to the decayed modus vivendi of the Romans as a res publica ammissa, the lost republic. And with historical distance, we know that for Rome, the loss of the res publica was not synonymous with collapse. On the contrary, there began a new period of Roman splendor involving a transition in Roman political form, which was initiated by the incident called Caesar and consolidated through the rise of Octavianus Augustus. In stark terms, the effect of this Caesarian and Augustinian policies was return to monarchy. And precisely because this change was unspeakable under the conditions of Rome, the Caesar era provides the first and yet unsurpassed example for the deformation of the political realm through pseudonymism. Down the centuries, the empire of the Caesars offered the performance of a monarchy which was never in a position to acknowledge itself as such. If there was a defining stylistic characteristic of Roman and Caesarean ruling rhetoric, then it would lie in the inflationary use of the Senatus Populusque Romana formula, which from the days of Augustus appeared on all decrees of the imperial chancellery and on all imperial buildings, regardless of the fact that Senate and people had long ceased to enjoy anything more than decorative and acclamatory functions. And in order to appreciate the role of Augustus, the first emperor in the history of ideas, he must be conceptualized as a grand master of ruling pseudonymism. His success rested in large part on the circumstance that he cultivated an increasingly vast chasm between words and things, in that he suppressed every open indication of his evident status as monarch. He expressed his position as ruler by harking back into the proto-populist title of the tribune of the people. He camouflaged his neo-despotic special status by borrowing for himself the title of Father of the Fatherland, through the use of which the patriarchal rights of the head of a household could plausibly be applied to city and empire. And naturally, we can also regard the religious and political chess maneuvers of the new solo ruler, namely his deification of Caesar, as part of a comprehensive pseudonymic strategy, because the facts and their names had to be systematically kept apart. The numinous attributes of power were to be styled in such a way that they attested to a transcendental election without the prescribed terminology of monarchy ever coming into play. And with reference to the phenomenon of Caesarean pseudonymism, we gain awareness of the fact that the function of rhetorical masking and strategic dissimulation in the field of political communication is exactly that. All powers, monarchy in the first instance, but also its republican forms of successors, were from early on driven towards pseudonymism in the form of a sustained false testimony regarding themselves. In a pseudological world in which circumstances are as good as never allowed to be called by their true names, the critics of power are often forced to issue their statements from the protection of anonymity and pseudonyms. Even a philosopher of the caliber of Descartes occasionally employed a pseudonym. Now, in what is to follow, I will pursue the presumption that in recent history an existence under false papers applies also to the nature of modern politics as a whole, in the sense that these are in the main presented under names such as republic and democracy. I wish to test the hypothesis that these political constructs may have been unavoidably and from the very start charged with a high level of pseudonymous activity. Should this assumption hold true, it could be conjectured that the widespread dissatisfaction with democracy is in fact a half-articulated protest on the part of the population against the pseudonymism of their rulers. Under their preeminence, the distance between phrases and circumstances has again become so wide that collective reason can respond only with skepticism and sullenness, or perhaps with resentment and contempt. In this passage, as well as in the following three extracts, I would like to develop evidence for the thesis that it is, in its current use, the term democracy is charged with pseudonymous energy. In the everyday course of public semantics, it serves the purpose of concealing four forms of how political power is really exerted, which could never be consented under their true names. I have named these four forms of intensive pseudonymism oligocracy, fiscocracy, mobocracy, and phobocracy. The term oligocracy refers to an original foundational feature of modern republic democratic systems of government, which was from the beginning as concise as it was controversial. It indicates that the collective, which is known as people, always represents a composite of the few, hoi oligoi, and the many, hoi polloi. And the prevailing characteristic of modern democracies after 1776 and 1789 lies in the fact that the few were in the future to arise from the many. And in the old system of estates, the oligoi were recruited from a few who were defined by birth, who outright called themselves the aristoi, literally the best, and thus aristocracy. They were joined by another few who were defined by a calling, who formed the clergy. Both groups together constituted at their height of maximum 3% of the total population. And since this time, the democratic system has rested upon a kind of mysticism of representation. It makes use of the concept of representation through consolidation. In the large populations of modern times, each parliamentary official is meant to be in the position of representing the intentions of 100,000 people, and in constituent assemblies, this concentration increases to a relationship of 1 to 1 million. And since as long ago as the early 19th century, the new democracies had chronically been suspected first by the early socialists of being nothing more than the conspiracy of a small, well-to-do minority against the outside majority of the unrepresented people. In fact, even more than that, it was seen as a coalition of the unproductive few against the productive many. Enduring remains of this suspicion can be found in the anti-liberal folklore of today. And certainly, the picture as a whole has been increasingly reversed in the course of the last half century. Once one is nolens volens brought to realize the extent to which modern affluence arose as a result of an innovation-driven and credit-based entrepreneurial culture. In the second place, among the intensive pseudonyms for the word democracy is a phenomenon of government of the fiscus, fiscocracy. Over the time, the fiscus rose to the position of the central organ of all modern statehood, ranking even above armies and parliaments. And from the very start, the noble term democracy always had a further function as a pseudonym for fiscocratic facts. As a modern state, due to a lack of plunderable neighbor states or colonial peripheries, is no longer able to finance itself through external booty, it must rely on the fiscal forbearance of its own population. And their tone is tested in constant cycles of raising and lowering of taxation. And the general tendency appears to be that critical majorities declare themselves to agree with the increased taxation of the creative minorities, upon whose economic products those majorities largely rely for support. And an intensification of the fiscocratic factor since the 19th century undoubtedly belongs among the specific qualities of those modern states which are called democratic. And this process was driven in large part by the development of the welfare state or the social state, but also by the subsidy state, and not to make a feature of the moment of the armament state. The German scholar Adolf Wagner preemptively conceptualized this tendency in his Wagnersches Gesetz of 1860, in which he set down the inescapability of the progressive extension of government activity. Yeah. And this was to be consequently accompanied by an analogous expansion of fiscal encroachments on the wealth of the population. The irony of Wagner's laws appears in the fact that their creator anticipated the rise of modern state in a quasi-prophetic manner, rather than as a result of empiricism. In Wagner's time, this was, when measured against today's standards, still as good as non-existent. In the third place among the intensive pseudonyms for the word democracy is a phenomenon of government by the masses, mobocracy. It reminds us that modern democracy was imbued from the outset with a quasi-self-parodistic factor. The concept of the people from which democracy drew its legitimacy have always carried with it a murky element, which anyone who wishes to wield power in their name had better avoid referring to. In fact, by wanting to draw legitimacy from the people, the younger democracies always also functioned as an empowering process with regard to groups whose qualifications for wielding power amounted to nothing more than their emotional ability to be mobilized. The English expression mob, which is in the modern meaning can be traced back to the 18th century, refers to a diffuse, predominantly vulgar, volatile, and moody street-based public which is disposed to occasional riots and outbreaks of violence. And under several symbolic steering mechanisms, the so-called mob had further evolved into a self-organizing bourgeois public sphere. And for more than 200 years, a form of the press, joined more recently by the broadcast media and internet forums, agitated in the name of emerging democracy and its unbounded freedom of speech, drawing inspiration from a self-parody of democratic thought. Their guiding theme is mobilize the currently incapable, those who are incapable for democracy, in order to make them a leading force of democracy. They produce a malign form of positivism, according to which formal equality before the laws equates to a substantive equality in the capacity for judgment. And the class-based suffrage of the 19th century had expressed a continuing hesitance regarding the premature endorsement of the equality principle. But in the universal suffrage of the 20th century, which had become systematically unavoidable, the will to ignore the mobocratic factor became manifest. And the deliberate blindness applies also to the fact that even in an advanced industrial country such as modern Germany, 1 in 7 of those who hold the right to vote can be considered as functionally illiterate. According to recent estimates, the level of illiteracy in the United States stands at 22%. And how high the levels of illiteracy were among the British who voted leave in the referendum of June 2016 has not been ascertained. It is only certain that the leave campaign was not infrequently conducted with the typical means of mobocratically disinhibited disinformation. Once elevated to a principle, democracy must finally come to terms with the fact that the majority of the dictators in the 20th century were elected dictators, the Russian revolution not completely excluded. This too grew from a minority putsch against the elected majority introduced through the election of autumn 1917. And for its part, the electoral success of Hitler in 1932 demonstrated that political votes on the basis of collective dysphoria or malaise do not necessarily lead to results which are compatible with democracy. Reason and majority only converge under favorable conditions. And the electoral victory of Donald Trump in November 2016 confirms the persistent topicality of the mobocratic factor. One can say all manner of unfavorable things about the 20th century and inevitably hits upon a sensitive point. Regarding its way of life, this era was every bit as inventive as with its ways of death. The only area in which the 20th century proved itself to be above reproach lay in its ability to find telling names for itself. Whether it called itself the atomic age, the century of the youth, the Jewish century, the era of sexual revolution, the epoch of fossil fuels, each expression of this type brought to the fore a notable characteristic of its overall development. But the most successful designation could well have been achieved by the English poet T.H. Auden, when he gave his epic poem about the contemporary age the title, The Age of Anxiety. And for now, the current situation of the phobocratic element in modern democracies remains dominated by the events of September 11. Since this day, nearly all politics has operated according to a principle of overreaction. This exposed vulnerability of the seemingly invulnerable catapulted the coordinates of safety awareness across practically the whole of the globe into an era of uncontrollable compulsion for control. Thanks to this American disorder, the phobocratic imperative has spread through the capillaries of the global community. After September 11, 2001, the massive preponderance of the phobocratic factor has called into question everything which was called democracy, in the best sense of the word, by the heirs of the Enlightenment, namely the steering of the Commonwealth by the markedly courageous collective wisdom of contributors. The post-democratic phobocracy of our time is intent on supplying countless citizens with unreal feelings of endangerment by styling the activities of a handful of attackers as a real and omnipresent danger. Terrorists who operate in the terrain of Western states can firmly rely on the national and international media to amplify every attack by a ratio of 1 to a million, and thus transform a foreign menace into self-menace. The media makers themselves persistently refuse to entertain the idea that terrorism constitutes is a publication strategy by which the constantly outnumbered aggressors uses the histrionic energy of the media to their own advantage. And from this, we can conclude that the term democracy functions as a pseudonym for phobocratic mechanisms. And this stands in blatant opposition to the foundational idea of all authentic democracy. The American President Franklin Roosevelt expressed this in his address to the nation on 6th of January 1941. In this great speech, he made his epoch-defining declaration of the 4 fundamental democratic freedoms. The first 2 of these, the freedom of expression and the freedom of confession, can be viewed as positive freedoms, while the latter pair, the freedom from want and the freedom of fear, can be categorized as negative freedoms. If one is to understand authentic democracies as the experimental arrangements for the local realization of human rights, then the freedom of fear, postulated by Roosevelt, should be addressed in the preambles to all democratic constitutions. In our media reality, it is as good as never addressed. However, as long as democracy continues to be in itself a pseudonym for phobocracy, the promise of human rights is hypocritical. It merely obscures the fact that traditional religious rule by fear has been replaced by political surrogates. The arms race between the great powers in the second half of the 20th century and the terror fixation of the Western Hemisphere after 2001 show very clearly that the realization of Roosevelt's four freedoms was not convenient to the general course of the events. The view forward in the 21st century grants us no expectation of improvement. That which we currently call terrorism is nothing other than the parasitic exploitation of the latent phobocratic condition of modern democracies by an enemy which is trying to compensate for its inferiority by exploiting our social order's willingness to weaken itself. It subsists on the fact that the most horrendous act will be granted the maximum attention by our medium system. And it therefore remains all the more important to hold fast to the guiding principle of authentic democracy in spite of all pseudonymizing tendencies. These principles are classically articulated in Roosevelt's freedoms. They are grounded in a conception of democracy which rests in a procedure, conception and definition of procedure. And accordingly, democracy in itself is never readily available in a form which suits prevailing conditions. Furthermore, it exists only as a precursor to itself from which it progresses to a more mature form. Thank you.
I'm so glad that we can open the discussion about the problem of democracy today, because the culturally and intellectual left of Europe has published several books in the last years which have been called post-democracy or simulative democracy or defect democracy. Yeah? And now our German public intellectual number one, Sloterdijk, has introduced a new term, said we are living in a pseudonymic democracy. Yeah? This is a wonderful thesis. When we ask the question, why is the populist right movement successful? Huh? Because they exploited precisely this feeling of the people, that we're living not in a real democracy, but there's a kind of camouflage. Huh? And he showed us that beginning with Augustus, when Cicero said, Res publica missa, huh? We have lost the republic. And now we have the same situation. We are losing democracy. Huh? And therefore we have to think about why do we lose it? Huh? And this proposition to say, instead of democracy, we have a new wording. The classical word would be camouflage. Huh? But now we say wording. Huh? And he showed us that because democracy means from the Greek word kratin, crazy, no? Who governs? No? And we pretend that the demos, the people are governed. And now he showed us that we are governed by fear. No? Phobocracy, we are governed by the masses, by the mob, by the hate speech people, mobocracy, we are governed by the fiscus, fiscality, and by the oligoi, by the few. And these are precisely the most important topics today, that we realize that this is democracy has become a pseudonym for the government of these four institutions, these four things. Therefore, I'm so happy that you introduced us very clearly in this horizon why democracy rises. At the moment, there's a symposium in New York from the Hannah Arendt Institute with the title Democracy Crisis. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah. We should not forget that the invention of democracy in the fourth, fifth century before Christ in Athens was due to the fact that the Persians came with a gigantic fleet from Asia into Greece. And Themistocles needed 14,000 people for the Greek ship And these were the poor of Athens. And and democracy is an invention or a secondary effect to the fact that we needed 14,000 people on the banks of rowing of the Greek fleet.
So the slaves had to become citizens.
Yeah, the slaves and day workers became citizens. And it was, after all, a military decision. They needed people on board of the Greek triremes. There were 3 rows of rowing. And these 14,000 people, won the battle, the sea battle of Salamis. And without that, would never have heard of something like democracy. It was a secondary effect of a military decision, of a military operation, and that was kept in the future. The Romans, in their own tradition, had never heard of anything like the government by the people. It was senatus populusque Romanus, and this formula integrated the situation. There were 500 families represented in the Senate, and the populace was always of second,
excluded,
more or less excluded.
Coming back to your physiocracy.
And the Emperor Caligula wanted to nominate his horse as a senator in order to humiliate the Senate and demonstrate them that there is no such thing as a second power next to the power of the emperor.
In your book, Time and Asia, you mentioned 2 incidents about the origin of physiocracy. So one was a citation by Franklin about what is sure in the life. So what is sure in life is death and taxes. So this was said by the famous inventor and diplomat Franklin, in the American one. He said, 2 things are for very sure, death and tax. So this is the beginning of physiocracy and phobocracy.
This is a famous quotation in a letter written to a French friend a couple of weeks before the French Revolution started. Nothing in this world can be said to be certain but death and taxes.
The beginning of physiocracy and fear. And you also mentioned Victoria as the first governor, because once she wanted to introduce, she had debts. Then they asked the ministers, how far can we go with taxes for the population, Peter? Remember? Tell this anecdote in your book. And you said, Queen Victoria said, one of the ministers said, maybe we should raise the taxes to 5% to the people. And then Victoria first said, it's impossible. Then our people would rebel. But today we pay 50% and nobody rebels.
I will need to interrupt to make sure, if you would mind, stay a couple of minutes, Professor, to give opportunities to members in the plenary if they have a couple of questions. I'll take 3 questions. If raise your hand, somebody will bring a microphone to you, and please make sure to speak in the microphone so that the interpreters can do their job. Yes, if you could introduce yourself, that would be most useful.
Jaroslav Andel. I wonder, Professor Sloterdijk, what are normative implications of your thesis? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'm sure you should have understood that what I did in my paper is to translate the ordinary discourse on democracy into the language of psychopolitics. And we all feel in our times that there is a new dimension in politics, that everything has become a psychodrama. Yeah? Everything is psychodramatically new, and our vocabulary is not really fit to cope with these new situations. Yeah. You can look wherever you want, on Russia, on Turkey, on the United States of America, on the restlessness of the Europeans. Everywhere there are psychodramatic events in the air. And therefore, I make here some proposals to develop more elaborated vocabulary to cope with this phenomenon.
Thank you.
And the most important implication is that there is no democracy without courage. The freedom of fear is the very foundation of democracy. As long as there's any trace of fear in the air, it is impossible to create the atmosphere of a democratic community. That's what my paper finally is all about.
Thank you. Hannes, did you want to speak?
So just to bring in the online perspective on things, thank you, Professor Sloterdijk, for this outstanding speech. And one thing that is coming up online is the negativity of the four forms of democracy you were talking about. So either mobocracy, phobocracy, fiscocracy, or oligarchy. And now we're wondering, looking at the online just as a common world, is whether we are actually seeing what is happening, or whether we are just seeing what people think what is happening. So we are seeing opinions rather than action, rather than fact. And the question that we would like to pose to you, of course, is what do you see as a way out of the situation you've described? Thank you.
Yeah. I think that the key problem is the phobocratic factor in current times. And why is that so? We can say that for about 2 decades, the motive of liberation, of freedom, has been replaced by the preponderance of security questions. And this is the key word for our time, is security. And this latent terror of security procedures is essentially self-destructive for a democratic community, because through the door of sorrow for security, that fear-driven motivations prevail. And then, good night, democracy. As long as these fear-driven motivations prevail, we cannot really talk of authentic democratic atmosphere. Atmosphere is not a meteorological question. It is an interpersonal or political reality, and the creation of an atmosphere of freedom is even more important than a written constitution in which a list of human rights is written down. There is something pre-constitutional that makes the constitution as such possible, and that is the freedom of fear.
Turkey is a government of fear.
Yeah. And that is why Roosevelt is so important. And we should as Europeans celebrate every 6th of January due to this fantastic speech of Roosevelt. Okay, thank you for your stimulating question.
Thank you very much, Professor, for setting the stage and the context for our conversations.